Perspective of the Black West, Buffalo Soldiers, Black Cowboys, and Untold Stories back in 2009 here at the booth. He's co-authored and co-edited Buffalo Soldiers in the West, Black Soldiers Anthology with Texas A&M University. He's done some work with Texas Tech University. You've got a book coming out later this fall.
Oklahoma University.
And I believe you're working on another book
yes,
that you were telling me about.
That's true.
So I think you will find him preeminently qualified to speak on the long list of things I gave him to talk about today. And he's got to squeeze it into just a few minutes. Before we get started, there is a couple of things I want to bend on. This man is a serious speaker, professor. I mean, I can't say. Why are you laughing?
Oh, wait. I figured there's a punchline here.
There is, and I'm setting it up beautifully. Again, I've known him for 11 years. And he was my mentor at the very first Western Writers meeting I went to in Spokane, Washington, back in 2005. I believe it was in Oklahoma City. I'm not remember the year. He introduced me as a member of the Mills Brothers singing group. For you older folks, you know they are a black group. And for the camera purposes, I'm not black.
But you could have been a doctor.
I could have been a doctor. In Knoxville, Tennessee, we went to a Western Writers meeting and on a field trip. The next day, he, Mike, and Melody Groves and myself went to breakfast together. He brought his own sack full of biscuits and shared them with everybody in the restaurant. At the Homestead auction, I believe it was in Bismarck, North Dakota. It might have been in Springfield, Missouri, but I'm not sure. They were having their auction of various things. He found out my number and is bidding on things with my number. I was asked the next day if I had paid for the things that I had bought. So having said all of that, I introduced to you my good friend, my great friend, and my mentor, Cowboy Mike.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You know, when I was asked by Phil to come and talk, a couple of things came to mind. One was really what got me involved in history in the first place. And then secondly, what sort of got me into the area of the Black West. And I'm going to try to share a couple of those things with you. And he did ask me to answer a couple of questions I'll try to answer as well. I have always loved history. I've always loved history. I didn't know I was a writer, but I did know I loved history. I was a young boy in Edwardsville, Illinois, growing up, and I can remember this very well. I was standing in a place looking over a rise, and I was wondering, now if I was standing here maybe 100 years ago, maybe 500 years ago, what would be coming over that rise? What animals would be coming over that rise? What people would I see coming over that rise? That was a young boy just kind of wondering that. The other thing I remember very distinctly is just listening to my grandmother. I had two grandmothers, and they both, again, could tell stories. And listening to what those stories, sitting at their knees sort of, and listening, intently listening to what they had to say. I know that, for example, one of the things that my grandmother would talk about, for example, is what it was like in the old days. And some of the stories she was telling me, they weren't stories from her memory. It was from her grandmother, her mother's memory, her grandmother's memory, would date back long before she was ever born. And those are the kinds of things I remember with my grandma Fanny. My grandma Dutch, which lives in another town, I would spend time with her as well, would tell me about family members, about prohibition, things that she did. She lived a very interesting life. My grandma Dutch had a Cupid doll on her leg. Now, my grandmother, again, now tattoos are very popular. Probably, I bet you Phil's got a Cupid doll on his leg right now. But I mean, you know, at a time when folks just didn't get tattoos very much, she had one on her leg, little heart, little shooting little arrow and things like that. She told me a story, but I won't get into that. It takes too much time. But again, she was a fascinating woman. And my other grandmother, my grandma Fanny, she was a great at saying little expressions that I took to heart, and I would use. Some of these you might be familiar with. For example, she would talk about something being in high cotton. Now, that was kind of interesting because we were in cotton territory. Where in Illinois they didn't grow cotton, but that was an expression that was used. I guess most folks here, you've probably heard that term high cotton before. When cotton grows high enough that you can pick it without bending over, it made it a much faster process, and we were in high cotton, we were in good times. Now here's one that you may not be familiar with. My grandmother, when something would happen that was very, very sad, she'd say, "Oh, that was sad as McKinley's funeral." And as a boy, I had no idea who McKinley was. But I knew his funeral was probably pretty sad, And so, later on, I was fascinated by that. So I actually went on the internet and Googled McKinley's funeral. And I see, again, all these people. Part of it was done in the rain and things. And it was really wearing dark clothes and it looked pretty sad. But, I've asked a lot of people about it. And it's an expression apparently was somewhat local. But again, has anyone ever heard that before? Yeah, and it was something that she would say. Another thing that she talked about was when someone was really not really connected, she'd say, "Oh, he's a lost ball in high weeds." All these little aphorisms, all these little witticisms kind of stuck with me, and I used them and would use them again in the classroom and as time went by. Knowledge itself intoxicated me. Words fascinated me as a young boy. My favorite book when I was growing up was a dictionary. I would just open it and just read through it. I just love words. I still do. Now, when I had a lot of buddies, and some of my buddies, they gained their fame on the athletic field. I had some great friends that were really good basketball players and were stars. So that was not my forte. I played some sports. My forte was when my friends needed someone to find something that was not easily found, where research was involved, where it required you to do some kind of study, they'd come to me. In fact, my nickname when I was in high school was the professor. That was my nickname, et cetera. And I guess it's something that did fascinate me. When I went off to college, before when I was in high school, they had, you could take an aptitude test. And I took an aptitude test. They said, you would be successful as a small business person. So, okay, all right. So when I got to college, I signed up for business. I took it. I was in it for about a quarter to a thing like that. It was okay. My love was history. I was fascinated by history. And once I really started taking my history classes, I changed my major to history. I liked it a lot. In fact, I became a tutor. One of the things that folks would ask me, since I did well in history classes, folks that didn't do as well would come to me and say, I wasn't Cowboy Mike then. They said, "Well, Mike, can you help me with the class?" I said, "Well, who's your teacher?" "Oh, Dr. Klingenberger, or this is Dr. Weston." I said, "Okay, well, I can get you a B in his class." I said, I can maybe get you an A in this class. And so I would tutor him for no money, which showed that I was not set for business, right? that was a big mistake, because if I really was going to be a businessman, I would say, well, I need so much up front. If you get this, I want that. No, I just did it for free. But it was a lot of fun. I've always liked that. I've always been interested in doing that kind of thing. I did not really discover that I could write until I became a staff coordinator for the White House Conference on Youth. They had every 10 years, they had a conference on children and youth. And they would meet in various places. We met in various places. I was with the youth section. They broke it into two sections, the children's section and youth. I was the youth section. And we met in various cities and things like that. After we met in these various places, I had to write a report. I wrote the report and submitted it to an editor. Anybody with a staff coordinator did that. And she was very complimentary of what I had written. And that kind of stuck with me. For someone who was a professional looking at my writing and saying, "You've done a good job with this," it really kind of said, maybe I could do this. It didn't make me really start to say, "Oh, I'm going to become a writer," but it made me feel confident in my writing. And indeed, it was important. When I moved to Georgia, I taught at Boggs Academy in Keysville, Georgia. And I was introduced once again to a childhood love. That is, again, Cowboys. I had been, of course, when I was a youngster, I used to have 6 shooters and a cowboy hat, but that was a long time ago. I remember I was taking a group back from Williamsburg, Virginia. We went up to Colonial Williamsburg. And on the way back, we stopped in North Carolina, and I bought my first cowboy hat as an adult. And I remember one of the young ladies that said, "Oh, Mr. Searles, don't buy that hat. I said, it makes you look like a cowboy." I said, "Well, okay." I said, "Oh, okay." And I started wearing a cowboy hat again. And it's interesting because at that point, the only cowboys that I had seen were the ones that were on either TV or in movies. I knew about Lash LaRue, I knew about Hopalong Cassidy, I knew about Roy Rogers, I knew about Gene Autry, but I'd never seen a black cowboy. Again, it wasn't until later, in fact, about 1965, there's a book called The Negro Cowboys by Derwin Jones. That was my introduction that there were actually blacks that could be cowboys, were cowboys. And that really did fascinate me a great deal. Now, after I really learned that there were black cowboys, and I bought my cowboy hat and stuff, I began to integrate black cowboy, really the Black West, into my social studies and lectures and things of that nature. I did that in my classroom. At that time, I was just teaching there at the Balk Academy, 7th grade. But the word got out that I knew something about the Black West. And so folks began to ask me, would you come and speak at our school? Which I began to do. I've been doing that for 30 years or so. And I began to wear my cowboy clothes and things like that. I'd go out and I'd do presentations, etc. And that continued on, and again, more and more involved in that. Later on, when I was working on a PhD, I went out in the American West myself and traveled there and had a chance to do a lot of interviewing. I interviewed a lot of black folks, a lot of black men who indeed had been cowboys, some all their lives, some for a period in their lives, etc. Those things and those interviews brought me deeper into what it meant to be, first of all, African. Being a black person in the West was not the same as being a black person in the South or in the Midwest or in the East. It was a different experience. I met black cowboys who grew up in towns where there are only just a very few blacks. Well, I grew up in town, now my Midwestern town, about maybe 10, 15% of the town was black. There was, like, when I was going to elementary school, I went to, when my first, second, and third grade was in all black school, and then the fourth grade was integrated. We went to integrated schools. But again, you live in various parts of the country where all your neighbors are black. You're always in school with black. Your churches, everything is around you black. In the West, that wasn't the case. I remember calling a guy on the phone once. It was funny. And he was talking to me, and I had no idea he was black because there was nothing in his voice that said, this is a black person I'm talking to. But he grew up in the West, in West Texas, where all of his friends were white. The only models, other than his family, all the models were white, and his language was. Nothing distinguished him as a black person. I thought it was fascinating. Growing up where you could tell often whether the person was black or not, things of that nature. Anyway, I began to do research, etc. And I came in contact through organizations like, again, WWA and WHA, Western History Association, with folks who wrote about the West, about blacks who wrote about the West. One was Dr. Quintard Taylor. Dr. Quintard Taylor, who actually came to the booth, I brought him to the booth quite a few years ago, and he spoke here. Good reception when he came. Again, an author, again, a well-respected president of various national associations, etc. Has an endowed chair now. He contacted me and said, Mike, he said, I'm writing some things for the American National Biography. And I told them to get in contact with you. He wanted me, he said, I'd like for you to write about a black cowboy. Now, this word today is kind of maybe a bit offensive and is not used very often. But he said, I want you to write about Nigger Ad. Well, I began to do research. And this black cowboy, that's how he was known. Every time I read about it, it was either Nigger Ad, Black Ad, or Old Ad. But that's how he was known. And so I began to do research on this black cowboy. In fact, there was a predecessor to the American National Biography. It was the Dictionary of American Biography. It was published in 1928 and 1936. Dr. Rayford Logan, outstanding historian who had taught at Howard University, had written about, again, Ad. But he didn't know his last name either. All he had was, but now this was not uncommon. A lot of time, black cowboys are either known as nigger or black, or in some cases, they might have, again, some kind of expression, like, for example, Bronco Sam or One Horse Charlie. But often they would distinguish these cowboys. It was helpful when you're reading the literature because you knew you were looking for a cowboy of color because of what, in fact, how he was described, that particular appellation. Well, I began to do research. And as I did research, again, I found a lot of folks who wrote about him. Fascinating fellow. Ad was a fascinating fellow because he could do something that cowboys didn't often do. Well, very few cowboys did. I hadn't seen any cowboys that had done this before. Here's what Ad could do. He could take a lariat, walk inside of a corral, and lasso a horse at full gallop and snatch the horse off his feet. Don't try this, Phil.
Okay.
Okay.
Make a note of that.
Make a note of that. Don't do that. He tied, don't do that. He would tie the rope hard and fast on his waist, lasso a horse at full gallop, and snatch the horse off his feet. Wow. Now, I read count after count after count. This wasn't, he didn't write himself. This wasn't, again, a lot of sort of wild cowboy stories, the kind that, Walt might tell or Jim might tell. It wasn't that kind of story. This was something he did. And so I wrote about him. Again, I didn't have his name, just knew about Nick Grant, that's all I knew. And so it just shows you about studying of history and writing. Much of what you come in contact with, we talked about serendipity last night. I'm at an archive in Midland, Texas. And I'm looking for things on ad. And in the process, I discovered a journal, a regional journal, that gave me his full name, Addison Jones. That was the first time I discovered what his name was. And it opened the door for me to find additional information, and I began to write about it. I'd written this essay, biographical essay, on ad for the American National Biography. But then I was able to, a few years later, I was contacted by Sarah Massey, who was editing a book called Black Cowboys of Texas. Texas A&M University Press had asked her to basically get an anthology together, and she called me and asked me who I'd like to write on. I said who I'd like to write on, and I was able to write a full chapter on Addison Jones, fascinating fellow. That opened the door for me to also begin to get some recognition. Texas, the Black Cowboys of Texas did very well received, got good remarks and things of that nature, et cetera, and had a chance to kind of go out and continue to talk and things of that nature. That gave me an opportunity to, again, to do this anthology with a colleague, Bruce Glassroot, on Buffalo Soldiers in the West. We again got that together, and that again was something that kind of added to my sort of chance to talk about things and write about things. Now, one of the things that Phil asked me to do, well, let me just mention too, because Phil made a reference to my current writing project is one on the Buffalo Soldiers, and American tradition. I'm doing this for a regional press out in New Mexico that I'm doing one for right now. Now, Phil asked me, how can writers of any genre, you see, he's rather sophisticated, of any genre, write any degree of honesty and authority about ethnic groups, whether Black, Indian, Chinese, etc., and their role in the American West? I want to give that some thought. I wrote it right down. And it's a challenging question to answer. I had the advantage of growing up, even though I did not grow up in the West, and I did not grow up on a ranch. I did not grow up on a farm. I grew in a small town. I had the advantage of being Black. I had the advantage of living in a Black community. I had the advantage of, again, being around a community of Black people and going to a church, at a Black church. Those experiences gave me some insight of what Black life was within that context. And I figured I could probably extrapolate to some extent. Of course, I was able to do that. That was an advantage. And so when I began to do writing on the West, and I think, and of course, I began to read books too about Blacks in the West and things of that nature. That gave me, again, a kind of a foundation on which to build. I'm also, again, I think one thing that helped me as well in this regard was I began to use photographs. When I was at Boggs Academy, when I went out to university and places like that, I would take images. I found these images, some years ago, and had cardboard or really paper images I would use. And I converted those onto a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint allowed me, when I was talking, to show things. And one of the things that, again, it did, you saw Black people quite often, their portrait kind of shots, the kinds that were done quite often in various places and things like that. But I had one image I liked a great deal, and it was of a family living on Nebraska prairie. The family was, again, the Reese family. They were just an interesting family. I'm looking to see just here. It was Speece. I said Reese. Speece. Moses Speece's family. And it was a picture, again, it was done by a famous photographer, Solomon Butcher. Nancy Plain did a great great, matter of fact, she won a spur for that. She did a great book called Light of the Prairie, and it had a lot of butchers' photographs in it, including, again, the Moses Speast family. What was interesting about that particular image was that it wasn't a single individual. It wasn't a Nat Love. It wasn't a Bass Reeves. It wasn't just a single individual. It was a family on the prairie. So you really got a chance to see a group of people sitting out about to have their photograph taken. And as you looked at them, it told you a lot about blacks in the American West. That one image, one that families migrated west as well as individuals. So I, again, I spent a lot of time talking about black cowboys, looking at black cowboys, et cetera, et cetera. But it said that black families also made that migration. And as you looked at the individuals there, you saw something else too. This particular family was doing well. Well, how could you tell they were doing well? First of all, the clothes that they wore. The clothes that they wore for the photograph were not working clothes. I've seen photographs of people, again, sitting out there. They got holes in their blue jeans. Their clothes, again, look not too, they're clothes, but they're just really work clothes, etc. There might be a wagon in the picture or something like that. But you got a sense these were just really working people, working close to the ground and not much, again, wealth, etc. But the Moses Speast family, the men were dressed in jackets and suits. The women in their nice sort of Sunday clothes. So, whoa. And then in the background, you saw not just a work wagon, the one you need to go into the fields. You saw a buggy, an upholstered buggy, and horses. This was something that you wouldn't drive. You didn't harvest in this conveyance. You didn't work it. This is something you got together when you went to church or you went to something special. So here was a family on the Nebraska prairie, the latter part of the 19th century, who were well-to-do, relatively well-to-do. Again, had some of the kinds of material features that suggested that they had done well in what they were doing. And I thought that was interesting. I always like to show that to kids too, to show again the range of folks that were actually in the West. Now, in order to, let me just mention this too, and I'm going to go back to Phil's question, and that is traveling in the West was also a very important feature for me. I lived in the Midwest and I lived in the South. I never lived in the West. I remember when I first traveled the West a long time ago, even before I really started writing, flying into Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm in the plane looking down and said, is this the Earth or is this a lunar scheme? The colors, the lack of vegetation. Lord, what is this? You know, it was fascinating that this is part of the United States. Well, when I traveled out in the West, later on I traveled West, I was always kind of amazed by, one of the things that I guess the preacher was saying today. He was saying today that if you go out into a place where you're disconnected from all forms of communication, no cell phone, no this, no that, etc., and you're just out there, suddenly you begin to see, in his words, God's majesty. You see this broad, open expanse. I remember being in places where you could stand in one place and see 4 different weather formations. Sun shining, raining, cloud in the world. Standing and see lightning. It's not raining where you are, but see those different weather formations. The land was just, it was just fascinating. It took you to a different place. It really did. And I think this has been an important feature in terms of my writing. Again, even though I'm not a fiction writer, I'm a nonfiction writer, but it has shaped my thoughts. It shaped my presentations and my understanding of those people who lived in that place. Now, Phil's question, let me get back to this question about how can a writer of any genre really write with any degree of honesty? That's tough, but I think one of the things that you really have to try to do as much as possible, try to gain as much insight to the people you're writing about as you possibly can. How do you gain that insight? If you can find, again, firsthand accounts of people who were of that group who wrote about themselves. In some cases, that's not easy. You may have to, in fact, go to secondhand as someone that had a real empathy and wrote about those folks to give you some insight. If you can go into the area and talk to people who have lived that life. When I talked to black cowboys who had done it all their lives, it was a different story. It was a different sort of insight. What made them do that? Why did you decide this as the life you wanted? Oh, I tried this, I tried that. That didn't work for me. This worked for me. Well, why would you like this particular? Well, this is something like this. Well, talking to some black cowboys that were in towns where there were very few blacks. I came in contact with black cowboys who, again, were working in various aspects around ranching, et cetera, rodeos and things like that, where, again, when they grew up, all the people they, again, associated with were white. Not because they were trying to discriminate, but they were people who did what they did. They liked cowboying, they liked rodeoing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, talking to folks who've had experiences like that really gives you an insight you wouldn't have. Story here. I heard all kinds of these stories. And of course, I was telling Phil, I was telling, again, Carol, everyone last night, that sometimes those stories, you weren't quite sure whether they were apocryphal. Well, I mean, you may not know this, but cowboys will tell tall tales. I don't want to break this to anybody, but they don't always tell the absolute truth. And so sometimes you weren't quite sure whether you were hearing something that they kind of thought was funny or whether it was really true. But I've heard some interesting stories. I told this one last night. I was in East Texas. I was on this ranch, the black guy's ranch, and there was like a little rodeo there. And what I discovered when I went to Texas, how many small rodeos there, how many small black rodeos. You know, there are a few rodeos that sort of have a national kind of profile where they will go from place to place and they'll be here and they'll be there, et cetera. But a lot of the towns had little black rodeos were just essentially black cowboys that they weren't most of them were not full-time cowboys. They worked somewhere, but they did this on the weekend. So I'm at one of these rodeos. And I'm talking to this guy. He said, well, I want you to introduce you to this fellow. So he introduced me to the fellow. And he said, Mike, I got to tell you this story. He said, I used to work on a ranch, he said. And, I rode quite a bit. He said, but I once got on this horse, and this horse worked just fine. He said, but there was times when this horse would just stop. What's going on? He said, when he would stop, he started to buck. He said, this horse bucked me off so high. When I came off, I broke my ribs, etc. I mean, I was all broken up. I said, it took me months to heal from that. So I was in the bunkhouse, I was in the house, and I was there with my wife. And my brother-in-law comes, and he brings some folks with him. His brother-in-law's got a show off. He said, I want to ride a horse. He said, brother-in-law, let me tell you. You can ride any horse on this horse in this ranch, but I would not ride this horse. Said his wife, said, brother-in-law, he's just telling you that. You can ride that horse. He said, now, brother-in-law, let me tell you something. He said, I would not ride that horse. Well, you know how that's going to end. He gets on that horse, and the horse did just fine until it came to a stop. He said, Mike, I got myself a good seat because he knew the show was about to begin. That horse bucked again. He pointed up to an area on the bar. He said he bucked. He threw my brother-in-law off, and of course he got all banged up and stuff like that. And again, it was again a very funny story. Of course, I wasn't being bucked off the horse or anything like that. It was funny to hear about it. And I asked him after. I said, "Did you ever ride that horse again?" Because there's something else you learn about cowboys when you kind of hang around them. They envision themselves as being pretty tough. They think they're pretty tough. And it's not, cowboys that do things that a lot of times other people won't do. And so I said, you ever ride the horse again? He said, oh, yeah, I rode the horse again. Now, he never told me that he got into that experience again where this horse made the kind of stop that let him know that he really wanted to buck. But he said, yeah, I rode him again. But that's kind of like something else I discovered about cowboys, that they were folks that basically didn't easily quit. And I guess if you're living an independent life, if you're living a life where you're out there on your own, I mean on your own, where you're not connected to anybody or anybody else. You're there on a horse and maybe you got some cattle, you're maybe moving from a place. You're on your own. You can't call, hey, nothing. And I think it kind of creates a kind of spirit, a kind of independent spirit, one that says, I can make it on my own. And I have to, not just I want to, I have to. If you lose your way, take your hands off the rein, let the horse lead you back. If you run out of water and you don't have anything to drink, you look for hoof prints where it's rain and drink out of the hoof prints. The kinds of things that you just wouldn't think of if you're just living a different kind of life. And so I would say, again, going back to how do you really get to an honest sort of, and I would say finally, let me mention on this too, this same thing, whatever you write, if it's not something you're really familiar with, it is best to let someone who is read your writing. I've had a chance at time to review this has not to do with Phil. Phil did a nice book, and I thought it was very, very good. I want to say this because I have reviewed this book. This lady wrote a book, and she included a black character in it. And I went and I read it. Oh my God. Ooh, boy. Ooh, 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 ooh. And it's kind of hard sometimes to tell people is that bad, and things like that. But it really does help to have someone that's familiar with your subject, intimately acquainted with your subject, and about the culture. What kinds of things would people do and not do? What kind of things would people say and not say? What would be their sentiment if you said this or if you said that? And if you're not familiar with the culture, you can just fall into some big traps. And one of the things about falling into a trap when you're writing, if someone, and this is true no matter what you're writing about, if you're writing about something and your reader is familiar with it, and you say something that is just wrong, they're inclined to put the book down and walk away. You don't know what you're talking about. You've lost my interest because you said something that's absolutely foolish. And I know it's foolish because of my own experience, et cetera. And so I say, after you do everything else, you read the literature, you do these kind of things, et cetera, it's good to have someone that knows that area well to read it and give you some critiques. And if you have enough courage to respond positively to that. Oh, I like my writing better than what well, yeah, you might. I think my words are just fine the way they are. Well, okay. But you better take some advice from folks that really have had that kind of real world experience. And I would say that. Let's see. Again, one of the things, again, that I thought, and by the way, how my time running here? I don't want to run over time. I'm okay?
Yeah, I'll cut off the mic when it's time.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that.
You see me folding up the computer?
Okay. That'll be the real hint, huh? Okay. Something I didn't mention again, I sort of made reference to the landscape of the West. I'll tell you a story that I found to be fascinating. And again, it gave me some perspective about the American West. I'm driving from El Paso on I-10. I'm going for San Antonio. I'm driving along and I see 3 dots in the distance. What the hell is that? Drive further, the dots get bigger. Drive further, the dot gets bigger. And then finally I said, my goodness, those are 2 cowboys following a doggy. My goodness. But it took me it took me a lot of miles to even recognize that. You really get a sense of distance when people say, oh, I could walk over there. Not too quickly, you couldn't. That's a long ways off. Something else I came to understand from talking to cowboys, and that was the open spaces I talked about really had an imprint on them. I was talking to this cowboy, I was interviewing him, black cowboy, and he talked about what it was like when he traveled from the West to the Southeast. He said, Mike, I felt claustrophobic. I said, what do you mean? I felt closed in. If you are in Montana and various parts of the West where you can see 360 degrees around you, and suddenly you can't anymore, it's an uneasy feeling. Because I grew up in the Midwest where you had a lot of deciduous trees and vegetating that didn't bother me, etc. But I didn't grow up in the West where open spaces were so important, so important. A story in that connection, which I thought to be very funny. This little lady, she grew up in the West and she had some kids. She took them to Georgia. She's driving down a road, not a highway, but an old road. And the road, the trees have formed a canopy. The kids started screaming. Screaming. They couldn't see the sky. I guess they thought they'd gone to hell. They couldn't see it, and they started screaming because they couldn't see the sky. Things like that. Now, you only learn those kind of things really from talking to people or seeing it or that kind of thing. And you wouldn't realize how important that is, how significant that is. That's the kind of thing I would say, again in terms of that. And I say also, if you can cultivate friendships with people, other writers and other folks too, that can really, help you. One of the things I discovered that I would never be a full-time writer. It's just too lonely. It's just too lonely. And I have greatest respect. Some of the writers I read, man, can they write? Wow. I read some writers and they just knock my socks off. First of all, sometimes I'm reading, these are Western writers who seem to have such a broad knowledge that they can bring into their novels. I'm amazed. I'm amazed at the kind of research, the kind of reading you'd have to do to be able to do this. They're not just talking about walking down the trail or riding past a stream. They're bringing in all kinds of allusions and references that are Catholic. They're broad. Anyway, the idea of me being pinned up in a room like this, I mean, I have to do this when I'm writing, just, but I wouldn't want to do it all the time. It's just too lonely for me. Just to do that. And for me, I have to be pent up to do writing. I've got a book that I've already signed a contract. I've got to write it. And it's going to require me to be pent up. But if I did that each and every day, because writers quite often, the ones I talk to, who basically say, I start my day at 8 o'clock. I have a bowl of cereal, I drink a cup of coffee, I go out on the porch and I write for 4 hours. I take a break, I come back, I write for 2 more hours. That's just one day. But they do that day after day after day. I have to be more engaged with people. I have to be more engaged with, I do, I really do. I really have to be engaged with people, in talking to people, listening to people, discussing things, etc., going places, traveling, etc. And I have a greatest respect for folks who can and who have, again, the desire to, in fact, again, do that kind of thing. And some of the great writing, some folks I read, and I read a great deal. I love to do that. Again, we'll spend their time doing that, and that's something indeed. Again, I enjoy what I do, and I enjoy people's response to writings that I've done. And I enjoy talking about it. Of course, one thing about writing, too, is that it advances your presentations. And one thing about it, too, and I'd say this is the last thing I'll say and give you a chance to, if you want to ask me some questions, that travel does for you. If you travel a lot, and if you write and you read, you don't meet strangers. If someone says to me, oh, Cowboy Mike, I was up in Seattle. Yeah. Or I was up in Vancouver. Oh, yeah. Or I was in El Paso, or I was in Lubbock, or I was in, I'm trying to think of the funny town I'm thinking about, Luckenbach, Texas. Yeah. I mean, those are the kinds of things that if you've traveled a lot, you've been a lot of places, etc., suddenly you have a way. If I'm in line with someone, and we're talking for a few minutes, I will find something that connects us, something that brings us together, someplace they've been, someplace they've traveled, something that they do, and it really helps, I think, a great deal. Again, when you're writing, and also, again, when you're just connecting with people. Okay, I've talked enough.
Okay, we have a question from one of our participants.
Okay.
Basically, it says, I'm paraphrasing, you write nonfiction.
Yes.
What does it take for a nonfiction writer to be able to write good fiction?
Wow. Well, something is interesting. I would say this. If you are a nonfiction writer, you have a lot of material. You have a lot of material that you can draw upon. Now, if you can draw upon that material in an interesting kind of way, and translate that, what you know, into literature, I don't know what it takes. Some people can do it very well, and they transition very well. Some of the more interesting books, again, I think one of the best trainings for that is probably becoming a newspaper writer. So many of the people that I have read, who again have a mastery of the language and can write in very interesting ways, again, have written for newspapers. And they've written all kinds of stories for newspapers and things like that. Now, again, you have a number of folks who are historians and scholars, et cetera, and also write very well. Writing is an interesting craft. It is. There's certain things you kind of, maybe you might be at 4 or 5 years old beginning to write poetry. And you might even at some time become, even at a young age, pretty proficient at it. Writing is a craft, and generally speaking, it takes something to write. It really does. It does. At least for me, it takes something to put pencil to paper. I guess you don't do that anymore, do you? Pencil to paper to basically come up with phrases and wording and write word pictures so that a person can read what you're saying and be transported to where you're talking about. Like you can almost envision, oh my goodness, that water was salty. Well, that water was fresh. He really needed that water. Whatever it might be. And of course, quite often, if we talk about people who write nonfiction, the nonfiction they write is pretty dull. I mean, it's not interesting at all. They write and they know the material well, but they're not very interesting to read, even when they're writing nonfiction.
An observation that I would have, since you write nonfiction,
Right.
I write fiction. The
Okay.
advantage that I have is that you have a high need for socialization.
Uh-huh.
I have all my imaginary friends with me.
Oh boy, well, that's sad, man. Okay.
You know, it's sad for you.
Yeah.
Do you find that people who that are nonfiction writers
Uh-huh.
like yourself, who try to go to fiction,
Uh-huh.
take too much of that information with them? In other words, I have read people who are
Oh,
very
yeah.
historically
Okay.
knowledgeable,
Okay.
and they put in every detail
Oh boy.
of the history of
Yeah,
a given
yeah,
scene
yeah.
or whatever, to
Yeah.
the point of
Yeah. Losing the
you
story.
just lost me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I don't need to know that there was 3 battles there 14,
Well, I tell you, you know,
100 years ago.
well, they do the same thing when they lecture. I mean, that's what happens at universities. I loved being a professor. I really did. It was fun because I really enjoyed telling a story. I guess part of it was at my grandmother's knees. I love stories. I love stories. And so I have historical information, but it's within a context. I used to talk about Andy Jackson at his inauguration. You know, Andy Jackson was really the first really Westerner who was elected president of the United States. And when he has when he's being inaugurated, all his old friends from the mountains and folks like that come to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. But then they go to the White House to join him for a social event. There's going to be like a little social event at the White House. And they come into it. And the story goes that they poured liquor in the punch and things like that. They had muddy boots. And so when I was in class, I'd get up on chairs, step on the chairs, and see how they would stand up in the chairs and stuff. You can do stuff like that. I love teaching for me is a performance art. And so what happened, the rest of the story is that folks got drunk. Again, they started brawling and stuff like that. Furniture got broken, and either he was pushed out a back door or back window. And of course, it also created in the image that his detractors hated and called him King Mob and things like that. Well, that was how I would lecture. And if I ever decide to, again, enter into your world, Phil, into the world of that dangerous world of fiction, I probably would bring that with me. But it's stories. But quite often, professors are not inclined to tell stories. They're more inclined to give you information, just the facts. And you kind of sit there like that. Same way when you're reading, you just gotta sit there because it's not that the facts aren't important, but unless they have a context, unless they can be put into a broader sort of thing. I mentioned this last night. One of the comments that really stuck with me was a student came to me one day after class and said, "Professor Searles, I cannot take notes while you're lecturing. I'm too fascinated by what you're saying to take notes. I can't do it. I'm just engaged with what you're saying." And that for me is what you'd like to bring into your fiction if you were writing fiction. But you're right. I think that's true. But that's the way they conduct their lectures at universities. And I mean, outstanding professors who write very fine books and are well recognized, but you would just be deadly dull.
How did you know when you found your voice?
How did I know when I found? Well, now, what voice are you talking about? You mean my big loud laugh? What do you mean?
Your writing voice. You know, they say of writers, you develop a voice that is unique to you as a writer.
Well,
That's what I'm assuming they mean.
okay. Now, it's interesting. I never really thought of it that way. I get what really helped me, and that was what I mentioned earlier, was to have someone that knew the craft well say, "You do a good job." When I was interesting with Sarah Massey, I talked to her sometime later. She edited the Black Cowboys of Texas. And when I talked to Sarah's now deceased, she said, Mike, of the chapters, I had about 20 chapters there. Yours was the best. Wow. I had to do the least amount of editing of your chapter. Wow. Wow. And I'm going to tell you something what an editor can do. She made it better. She made my chapter better. I read what I said. I read what she didn't rewrite it, but she made it better. But I was very impressed with it. I think whenever, and that's probably what gives you sort of the confidence that you can begin to write, is when folks who know writing can look at what you read, what you've written, and say, this is good. I mean, your cousin, your grandma, your mom might say anything's good. Oh yeah, oh Johnny, you did a great job. Yeah, okay, sure. But someone that really knows writing looks at what you're saying and say, this is good. I think maybe, not for everyone, maybe you develop your voice over time, that you begin to feel like confident in what you're writing about and the way you're writing about it. Right now I write for a local newspaper. I write an article every week. I love it because I'm no more. I'm emeritus. I don't teach anymore. But writing makes me writing articles for the nursepaper. It makes me a public historian. People stop me on the street. Hey, Cowboy Mike, how you doing? Hey, Mike, how you doing? And will engage me in conversation about what I've written, or say, I really like what you've written. I've said the story before too. I was throwing some newspapers away, and I was actually putting in the recycling bin, and this pickup truck drives up, and this couple inside. So, you the fellow that writes for the newspaper? So, yeah, I am. Keep doing it. Of course, Tony's always a little scared when people think like that. She figured like people don't like what I'm writing and will shoot me because I write political stuff and things like that. Anyway, but I think that's what kind of maybe develops the sense, your voice, your sense of what you're writing, and your confidence about your writing is when you get a positive reception to what you're writing.
Okay, one last question.
Oh.
Anybody have it? I've got one.
Do you have anything? Your book on Buffalo Soldiers.
Right.
Can you really, very fast, how did the term Buffalo Soldier come about?
It's controversial, as many things are. The theory that I accept, and this is one that, again, Professor Lakey actually, again, says in his book on Buffalo Soldiers, is that when the Cheyenne, or when the Indians in Kansas saw black men for the first time, that they saw the texture of their hair, and it reminded them of the mane, and I've heard 2 or 3 different variations of this, of the buffalo, and that's why they call them Buffalo Soldiers. I've heard, it's because they wore buffalo coats. Oh, at the time it was winter and things like that, but that's what Bill Lakey said.
I like that
Yeah,
version.
I do too.
That's a cool version.
And he said he talked to, again, some Indians out there, some elders out there, and that's what they told him, and that's what he accepted as how it came about.
Because I've read several
I have too.
fiction books on Buffalo Soldiers.
Right.
Charlie Goodman, who used to be a member of WWA, did several books on Buffalo Soldiers.
Yeah, and so you get different stories on that. You really do.
That's cool.
Okay.
One of the things that when you read my manuscript, you pointed out that they wouldn't have said it in the time period I was writing about. They wouldn't have said it that way, but they would have said it like today. And so I was taking today's way of saying it and taking it back. For example, the use of African American.
Right.
I'm assuming they would not be referring to them in the 1880s.
No.
That way.
And I guess and here's where you get into some very sticky areas. I wrote about niggerad. That word is high. People want to take it out of Tuck Finn. It's a very touchy area.
Right.
And if you use that word, you better use it sparsely.
Right.
You can introduce it, but I wouldn't do it repeatedly because, again, you're going to have a lot of people who will be highly offended. There are words that are used today, like, for example, the cowboys that were called Nigger Joe, Nigger, never, and of course, now they're not writing about it, but it was used so commonly at the time that it wouldn't have the same punch as it does today. I've been in places where they've buried the word. They've had ceremonies where they've buried the word and things like that. And so at a time when people used it quite often, I don't know if it was, well, matter of fact, I met one cowboy, when they stopped calling him that and calling him Negro, he said, no, don't call me that. I don't write about that, but I came across it.
Yeah.
I've been called nigger. That's my name. That's who I am. You know, and I'm not Negro Joe, whatever it might be. But that, yeah, language language can be very sensitive, and you have to be somewhat concerned when you write, because again, you can get into a lot of trouble and a lot of conflict over it. Again, I think once you establish, if you need to establish it, but then after that, like for example, you best to, kind of tone it down.
Okay, I want to thank you for coming.
Okay.
And for bringing your lovely wife. I want to thank those that are online that joined us today. I appreciate them being here. And this has been recorded, so we will have it on YouTube at some point in the future.
In about a week.
In about a week.
Mm-hmm.
And so for your friends and neighbors that didn't hear it and would like to, they can go back.
Do I get any residuals for that?
Yeah.
We'll get you lunch.
everything.